Good afternoon. I'm Greg Smith from successnc.org, and welcome to today's webinar, Multiple Measures for Student Placement. This webinar is brought to you by the North Carolina Community Colleges and Success NC. Throughout the presentation today, we want to hear from you. Please type your questions and comments in the chat box located on the right side of the screen. I'll be watching the chat box and capturing all of your questions, and we've scheduled some time today at the end of the presentation to address each of these questions. At this time, I'll turn it over to Cynthia Liston, the Associate Vice President for Policy, Research, and Special Projects for the North Carolina Community College System, who will introduce today's presenter.
Thank you, Greg. It is indeed my pleasure to introduce Dr. Clive Belfield, who is willing to spend some time with us talking about some really interesting research and its implications for students and for our colleges here, community colleges here in North Carolina. Before I turn this over to him, I just wanted to provide some context and background for this research. This may be old information to some of you, but it may be new information to others. As many of you know, North Carolina is one of 6 states participating in a 3-year initiative looking at ways to improve developmental education, including examining our placement policies. The Developmental Education Initiative's overarching goal is to increase the number of students who enroll in and successfully complete college-level coursework in our colleges. I think given that post-secondary credentials are more important than ever for individuals striving to earn a good wage, this work is a really important part of efforts to increase the number of students who leave our colleges either by successfully transferring or earning a credential that carries some labor market value. This work, the DEI work, has been steered by a 30-plus person DEI state policy team formed by Dr. Scott Rawls, our system president, that comprises a wide variety of college leaders from across the state, including presidents, chief academic officers, chief student development officers, faculty, state board members, and our state superintendent at DPI, June Atkinson. The state policy team meets just about quarterly and has 4 subcommittees, one of which is placement. And it's that placement committee that reached out to the Community College Research Center at Columbia University to conduct a study on whether high school transcript information could be used to predict college success in our institutions and to look at how well our current placement tests do in predicting college success. I think it's safe to say that the results of this study were very interesting and quite frankly surprising. And as a result, we've been encouraging a statewide conversation about the research and its implications. In particular, this conversation is focusing on how we may want to reconsider our placement policies and use GPA as part of the placement system. This policy issue is being discussed in great detail. It was discussed at the most recent president's meeting. And there is a statewide multiple measures working group that is an offshoot of the DEI state policy team. And I know many presidents and chief academic officers have brought this topic up on our campuses through faculty convenings and councils as we've looked for feedback from across the state. So this webinar is part of an effort to promote and broaden the conversation, and we're very happy to have Dr. Belfield here to discuss the research. For those of you who are attending the system conference in a couple of weeks, you'll also have the opportunity to hear Clive speak there. However, that presentation will be a kind of a broader focus, kind of more big picture focus on access and placement issues, whereas today we're really going to delve more deeply and specifically into the North Carolina research study. So therefore, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Clive Belfield. He is an Associate Professor of Economics at Queens College and a Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University's Teachers College. So Clive, I turn this over to you.
Thank you, Cynthia. As Cynthia mentioned, this is work that we have been doing at the Community College Research Center at Teachers College. We've been doing this with the NCCCS system, and we developed this research together, but We have also been doing this work in another community college system, and we found very similar results in the other system too, and we suspect, given our discussions with other systems and general evidence from across the country, that this is not a North Carolina issue. This is a much broader issue, and so the results for North Carolina are very interesting, and hopefully they are informative, but insofar as they speak to something specific about North Carolina, we think this is a much broader issue across the country. And in some ways, North Carolina we have been we feel very lucky to have partnered with the system, because this gives us a chance to get into the front and ahead of some of these issues, rather than just reacting to what we see on the ground. So let me start off. I have a reasonable number of slides to go through, and so I'll just go through them, and as was mentioned, the questions come at the end. I'm obviously happy to take questions at the end. So this is the topic is metrics to place students in developmental education, and as Cynthia mentioned, we have a developmental education system which is very large. Most students entering community college across the U.S. are assigned to developmental education, and only about 1/3 complete their developmental education sequence. This is work that the Community College Research Center did a few years ago, tracking individual students as they get assigned to developmental education. How many pass what level do they get assigned to? Do they enroll at that level? Do they make it through that level? If they make it through that level, do they make it through the next level? And then do they eventually get to the college level classes? And we find that only about 1/3 complete their developmental education sequence, and then only 1 in 7 pass college math. And so what you have is a group of students who are assigned to developmental education, and they are much less likely to graduate it. Conservatively, 25 to 40% less likely to graduate from college. So we know that assignment to developmental education is a big thing, and we also know that it's very influential. Assignment really matters to the student, and so that means it's a very important assignment decision that we have to make when the students enroll in community college. Now, typically, most colleges will use one of the 2 big tests to assign students. They'll use the AccuPlacer or the Compass test. North Carolina also uses the Asset test, and we looked at that as well. But the big 2 tests are the AccuPlacer tests and the Compass tests in math and reading. And so in North Carolina, we looked at 4 of the 4 tests, 2 in math and 2 in reading literacy, and we looked at them for AccuPlacer and for Compass to see how they do in assigning students to developmental education or remediation. So that was sort of the initial idea, is how do these tests actually assign students to developmental education or to college level classes. And so we are interested in how accurate these placement tests are, and by accuracy there are 2 sorts of errors, and this is true for any test that is trying to assign people to a treatment or to a non-treatment group, to anything. If you're assigning somebody, there are going to be 2 types of errors, and the first one is you're not going to put somebody in developmental education, but you should have put them there. So those people, we call those people overplaced students. So they're not in developmental education, but they probably should be, because they're not ready for the college courses. That's one error. The other error is on the opposite side. We put a student in developmental education, and they probably shouldn't be there. So that group we call underplaced. And so then you have these 2 errors, and they have to be balanced out. So if I put everybody in developmental education, then I'm going to get a lot of underplacement. if I put everybody in college level, I'm going to get a lot of overplacement. So where I draw the line, I'm going to get some underplacements and some overplacements, and so it's a balancing act. Inevitably, your rule is going to have some people in the wrong or in the expected wrong assignment for them. So it's this is something that is not anything to do with the placement test. It's purely a matter of if you make a decision, you could have an error on one side and an error on the other side, and those two errors have to be balanced off against each other. So that's the first issue that we try to think about. And so we just look and we say, well, how accurate are the placement tests at balancing these errors? And then the second part of the research question is, every test will make some errors, but can we use a different assignment rule, high school information, to make fewer errors, to basically to improve the accuracy? So those are our two overarching questions. We have to have students in developmental education if they're not ready, and we want students to go straight into college if possible. How accurate are we at making those decisions, and do we have anything else that's available that would make those decisions more accurately? So we identify two metrics to think about this. The first one is a straightforward one. It just says, well, what is your score on the placement test, and what are your college grades? So if you get a high score on the placement test and then you get low college grades, that probably means the placement test is not very helpful. If you get high scores on the placement test and high college grades, that probably means the metric is very helpful. So that's one correlation. One validity metric is just those straightforward correlations. And then the second metric is the one that we prefer because it gives us a way of getting at this idea of there are two errors and you want to balance those errors out. You don't want either set of errors, but really you want to think about both errors together. And we call this the severe error rate. And I'll talk a little bit about what the severe error rate is. So the severe error rate is the following. You're faced with a student, and the student comes in, and you put the student in the student goes into developmental education, but under our model of how we think students would perform, which we use data for, under our model, we think that student would have probably gotten at least a B in Gatekeeper English or Gatekeeper Math. So the student ends up in developmental education, but actually we think, using a statistical model, that that student would have probably gotten a B in either Gatekeeper English or Gatekeeper Math. So we think that's a severe error. That's an error that's not helping the student. We're putting them in developmental education. That's going to take them time, might make them a little less motivated. It's going to cost them money, when in fact they probably could have gotten at least a B in Gatekeeper English or Math. So that's the first type of error. The second type of error is we say to the student, oh yes, you're ready for college math or college English. We're not going to put you in developmental education. But then they go straight into the Gatekeeper course, but they fail that course. So that's an error where we've overplaced the student. The student's been put into a course that they're obviously not ready for, and maybe they would have benefited from developmental education. So we sum those two errors. We say we don't want either. We want as few of those errors as possible, the overplacement and underplacement errors. And we call this a severe error rate because the B is a pretty good grade in a course. So if we hold you back and we think you would have gotten a B, that's a pretty severe error for the student. If we hold you back and we think you would have gotten a D, that's not such a bad error. But if we think you would have gotten a B, that's really holding somebody back. And then the failure is a straightforward. Ideally, we would like all the students to come in who have the ability to pass the Gatekeeper course, and if they don't do that, then they, for some reason, were not prepared to take the course and pass it. So we use a statistical model to predict, based on their assignment, using the placement tests. So we look at how the placement tests score, which can go from 0 to all the way up to 120 in some of the tests, and the scores for Acuplacer and Compass are scaled differently. But we look at all of those scores, and we look at how we predict you would do in the Gatekeeper courses if based on your placement test score. So that's one way of looking at the severe error rate. We basically predict how well you would do in the courses. The second, the alternative to using the placement test is to use high school information to assign students. So in other words, we look at the student's entire high school transcript and we predict whether we think they should be in developmental education or not, and then we predict what grade they will get in the Gatekeeper course subsequently. And in order to do this, we keep the same number of students in developmental education. So the measure is as follows. If there are about 65% of students in developmental education based on a placement test, we just take we just take the 65 students with the lowest high school scores, the least promising high school transcripts, and we assign those students to developmental education. Then we predict how well those students would do. So it's a way of comparing the placement test with high school information to see what the error rates would be for students. Now it's a little bit complicated because you can't see the equation, so it's not very intuitive to understand. But it's basically a way of predicting how well students would do based on the information we have about them, either their placement test or their high school transcript. Now, the analysis gets a little complicated because we only see students who are placed in developmental education or not placed in developmental education. And the placement test is what we use to put them in developmental education. So if you looked at the placement test scores and whether a student was in developmental education, you would see a perfect correlation because the placement test is what is used to put the student in developmental education. So what we say is that being placed in developmental education is something that is going to interfere with your college outcomes. And so we need to sort of strip that out. We need to strip out the fact that, of course, placement tests explain who's in developmental education because those are the things that are used to put students in developmental education. So we use two solutions to get around that. First, we look at students who score above the placement test cutoff and students who score below the placement test cutoff. So we would expect that if the placement test cutoff is a 25, then for all the students who score less than a 25, we would expect that students who score a 20 would do better than students who score a 15, would do better than students who score a 10. And if the placement test score is a 25, we would expect students who score a 30 to not do as well as students who score a 35 or students who score a 40. So we separate out the students depending on whether they meet the placement test cutoff or not, and we look at if the relationships between the placement test and high school information change above and below the cutoff. And then the second solution is we extrapolate from students who pass the placement tests to generate predictions for students who fail the placement test. So we sort of go down the placement test scores, and we're generating predictions of who will fail the Gatekeeper course, even for those students who never got to the Gatekeeper course because they failed the placement test. So that creates the challenge is that the placement test is part of the system, and we somehow, in order to analyze what would happen, we need to somehow strip that out of our analysis. Now, fortunately, we have very good data to look at this question. We have linked student data. We have high school information, so North Carolina high schools. We have the student's high school GPA, and we have a whole set of information based on their high school transcript. Now, the high school transcript has the number of courses, the number of honors courses, the number of college-level courses you took in high school, the number of math courses, the number of English courses, any F grades the student got, the total number of high school credits. It has a lot of information in it, the high school transcript, and we think that information should proxy for student effort, student aptitude, student subject proficiency, and their preparedness for college. So when we started this research, we thought we would have a great model of how to explain student behavior in college, and that we would focus on their effort, their aptitude, subject proficiency, and college prep, all of those things. So we have a lot of high school information on the students. Now, we also have their AccuPlacer and Compass tests. We have their 2 tests they take in math and 2 tests they take in reading. And then we have, linked to this, we have their community college transcript data. So we have the students' college GPA, we have the number of credits they've gotten after 3 to 5 semesters in the system, and we also have their grades in Gatekeeper Math and Gatekeeper English courses. So we have a follow-through of a student who's in high school and then comes into the community college system, takes an AccuPlacer or a Compass test, goes through into the community college and gets a college GPA, college credits, and gets grades in Gatekeeper Math and Gatekeeper English courses. And we have this data for the North Carolina system, all 58 colleges, but we also have it for another system. This was the other system that I referred to. We have this for 2 systems, and the results are very similar for both systems. And as I mentioned, we think this is a much more of a general issue than specific to North Carolina or the other system. So we have a lot of data to work with. We have a couple of years of all the community college students, and so we can analyze a lot of these questions that we're interested in. When we look at the placement tests, we see that the first thing we see is that your placement test score has a very weak, it's positive, but a very weak positive correlation with your college GPA. So if you get 35 on an AccuPlacer or a Compass, that doesn't explain much at all about your college GPA. In terms of a prediction of how well you're going to do in college, the placement test is not great in terms of how well you're going to do in your college GPA. Now, the placement test has a moderately strong positive correlation with college credits. That is, the higher your placement test score, the more college credits you're going to get. But that's somewhat not unsurprising, because the placement test is going to put you into, if you pass the placement test, you're going to go straight into a college level class. So we would expect that the placement test would help you get more college credits, because the placement test is telling you whether you can take college credits. Now, these results are the same if we look at students who fail the placement test and who pass the placement test. So there's a weak correlation generally, and there's a weak correlation above and below the placement test. And these results are pretty much the same for the math tests and the English tests and the AccuPlacer and the Compass tests. So this is not a specific test problem. It's not a specific subject problem. The placement tests are really not incredibly predictive of what is going to happen when you get into college. We have the severe error rates. Now, these severe error rates, as I mentioned, are the sum of how many students would have done well in the college level class but didn't actually get into it because they were assigned to developmental education, and the students who failed the college level class and so probably should have been in developmental education. And you can see, unfortunately, these scales are not the same, so we have to be a little careful. That scale is at 30 and that one is at 35. But as you can see, for college English, about just over a quarter of students, and for college math, just over a quarter of students have a severe error rate. So in other words, we think the placement test is misassigning about just over 25% of the students into college English and college math. There's another version of college math in the North Carolina Community College system, and that version is a little harder, is a little higher level, and there the placement tests are a little better at assigning students. But nevertheless, that's still an error rate of around 15%. Those are the results for Compass. The results for AccuPlacer are very similar, if anything a little bit higher, so this is over 30%, and for college math it's between 17 and 21% who are either going to fail the college math if they're put straight into it, or they were going to get a B in the college math but were assigned to developmental education because they failed the AccuPlacer test. Now, as I said, every test makes errors, and so these numbers may seem high absolutely, or they may not seem high absolutely. The only real test is, are they high relatively to some other information that you could use to assign students. And so this turns us to the high school GPA as a potential source of information. Now, when we look at the students' high school GPA, the students who come through the North Carolina public schools, we see a very strong correlation between your high school GPA and your college GPA and college credits. And this correlation is much, much stronger than you get for the placement test, and the correlation is very strong for students who fail the placement test, and it's very strong for students who pass the placement test. It doesn't matter whether you're above or below the cutoff for the placement test. Your high school GPA still makes a big difference for how well you're going to do in college, both in terms of the credits you accumulate and the GPA you have through your semesters in college. Now, we also have all this high school transcript information, and we thought, well, effort is going to matter, aptitude is going to matter, college prep is going to matter. All of these other things will matter, and we'll be able to read the high school transcript, and we'll be able to say all these wonderful things about students and how well we think they're going to do. And it is the case that if we look at the high school transcript, we see that your high school transcript, the information on your high school transcript does predict your college GPA, and it does predict your college credits. And this is true whether you fail the placement test or whether you pass the placement test. But high school GPA dominates the high school transcript information very strongly, which we were somewhat surprised about. Very strongly, we don't need anything off the high school transcript other than the high school GPA. So I'll show that in the next slide. But the bottom line is that we thought we would be able to do a really good job of predicting how well students would do based on a lot of information. But in fact, the high school GPA crystallizes all the information that we can use from the high school transcript. So that was a little surprising to us, perhaps not surprising to you, but it was surprising to us how dominant the high school GPA would be. The other thing about the high school transcript is it's actually a little confusing to interpret. So I myself have done this with entering students. They'll bring in a transcript, and I'll try to read the transcript, and I'm looking at it, and I'm looking at it, but I'm not really sure what I'm looking at. I look at the courses, and I look at the grades, and I think, well, you did well in this, but you didn't do well in that, and you seem to have done this, but not that. And by the end, I'm kind of I'm going a little bit on feelings, which is a little difficult for a professor to work with. So the high school transcript is a little confusing to interpret, and I'll show you what I mean on the next slide. The next slide is how the high school transcript correlates with your performance in the North Carolina Community College system. So what we have is your college GPA and your college credits earned. And what we have down here are all these different measures of from your high school. So straightforwardly, we have your GPA, and your GPA is very strongly correlated with both credits earned and GPA. So you can see this number is very strong. If your college GPA goes up by 1, your community college, if your high school GPA goes up by 1, your community college GPA goes up by perhaps about 0.8, probably a little bit lower than that, but in this model about 0.8. So if you go from being a B student to an A student in high school, you're going to go from being a B to an A minus student in college, if that makes sense. So this is a very strong effect. If your GPA goes up by 1 point, after 3 or 4 semesters, 3 to 5 semesters, you're likely to have 12 credits more than the average student, which is very large given that the average student is not very close to completing after 3 to 5 semesters. So 12 extra credits for 1 extra point of high school GPA. In contrast, we have down here all of these other bits of the transcript: total courses, honors courses, college level courses, math courses, English courses, any F grades, total high school credits. And what you can see is that these things do have correlations with your GPA and with credits earned, but those correlations are conflicting and they're very small compared to the high school GPA correlation. So in fact, the more courses you've taken actually has a negative effect on your community college GPA. So students who come in and they say, oh, well, look at all these courses I took in high school, that doesn't correlate at all well with your community college GPA. Plausibly, if you've got F grades, that correlates negatively with your North Carolina community college GPA, and it correlates negatively with your credits earned in the community college system. But again, these effects are not very large compared to the high school GPA effect. And some of these numbers are negative, some of them are positive. It's a little hard to process this information into a simple rule. So if a student gives me their transcript, it's very hard for me to look at it and say, well, honors courses are worth that, college level courses are worth that, math courses are worth this, English courses are worth that. That's too confusing to process. Much easier just to look at this high school GPA. Now, so the first part of our analysis was, well, high school GPA is really predictive. The second part is to say, well, if we predicted if we recalculated severe error rates just based on putting students in according to their high school GPA, what would the error rates be, the severe error rates? And we can see the numbers here, and these severe error rates are much, much lower than we had for the placement test. So the errors are below 13% for Compass English, close to 11% for Compass Math, and then a little bit higher for AccuPlacer English, but still less than 10% for College Math. So we can see that if we put these together, we can see the difference in the error rates for the two assignment rules. So the Compass rule and the Compass test and the AccuPlacer test using either a placement test, which are the blue bars, or the high school GPA, which are the red bars. And you can see that in each of these cases, the high school GPA is a much better predictor. It generates much lower severe error rates in comparison to the Compass and the AccuPlacer tests. And you can see that this is not a Compass issue or an AccuPlacer issue. It's a general issue. It's not an English issue or a math issue. It's a general issue. So it's not based on the test. It's not based on the subject. It just seems that high school GPA is a much better. High school GPA generates much lower error rates in placing students. So, and this, as I mentioned, is a similar result that we get when we look at the other system. Now, so that leads us to think, well, let's see what it is about high school GPA, and let's see if this result really is a sensible result. And so the first thing we thought was, wait a minute, high school GPA is not really very predictive. It's compressed. Some students get zeros and some students get 4s, and you can't get more than a 4, or in some systems a 4.3. But that turns out not to be the case. Very few students get zeros and very few students get 4.0s. High school GPA is a variable, and it does have a distribution, and so the distribution of that variable is informative about which students are going to do better in terms of college GPA and college credits. We looked at high school GPA and we said, well, maybe the ACT is better than high school GPA, or maybe the SAT is better than high school GPA. And we looked at how high school GPA and ACT and SAT compared with each other in terms of a student's community college GPA and college credits earned. And so I can show you the results from that in a minute. And then we said, well, the high school GPA, it's all about the school. Some schools give high GPAs, some schools give low GPAs, some districts give high GPAs, some districts give low GPAs. It's all a function of where the students got into school. We find that that's not a big deal, really. And then we said, well, how can a high school GPA really carry on? How can it persist as something that is helpful to you? And it turns out that when we look at some other literature, we see that studies that have followed students up to age 40 look at their high school GPA and see that there's a pretty good correlation with this person's income and their high school GPA. So high school GPA appears to be something that in other studies can be picked up quite a long time after you go to high school. So here's the high school GPA of students in the system, and you can see that it has this bell-shaped distribution, and it has a mean at about 2.5, and it has a standard deviation of about 0.6. So you can see that hardly anybody is down here, and hardly anybody is up here, and so because we have so many students, these students with lower GPAs are predicted to not do as well as these students with higher GPAs. So this distribution is something that is not simply everybody's getting D's and everybody's getting A's. There's a nice spread here of GPAs. Then we look at how the high school GPA compares to the SAT and the ACT. And what we see is that these are correlations again, and we can see that if your SAT goes up by 200 points in the North Carolina community college system, your community college GPA is only going to go up by about, well, it's actually going to go down. If your ACT goes up by 4 points, your college GPA is also going to go down, but it's not significant. But it's certainly not, there's no evidence that students with higher SAT scores or ACT scores will have higher community college GPAs. And that's true for their college credits as well. They won't have accumulated more college credits, and they will have accumulated slightly fewer developmental education credits. But again, that's not a very strong effect. In contrast, when we look at all these measures together, we can see that if your high school GPA goes up by 1 point, even if we control for your ACT or SAT score, there's still a very strong effect on your high school GPA. There's a very strong effect on your college credits, and there's a very strong effect on developmental ed credits. So even if we have a student who's got a high school GPA and an ACT score, the high school GPA is more predictive than the ACT score. So that suggests to us that the high school GPA is outperforming other general college preparedness, college entry, college ready tests. The third thing that we thought of, which we think has some legitimacy but not a huge amount, is that some schools grade more easily than other schools. And what this graph shows is, it shows there are about 550 schools in North Carolina, and for which we have data at least. And so each of these schools is put along the bottom here, sorted by high school. So each of these dots is a high school. And what this column tells me is the effect of the high school on a student's GPA. So it's telling me which high schools have negative effects on GPA and which high schools have positive effects on a student's college GPA. So what we would be looking for is we'd be looking for a lot of colleges that have a very strong effect, either because they grade too tough, which would be this group, or because they grade too easily, which would be this group. But this line, these two lines here, tell me basically the standard deviation of this effect. So the range of effects where I pretty much can't tell whether there's a school effect or not. I don't think there's a school effect within these lines. So this drawing is a lot of fun for me, but I guess a little too confusing. So all of these schools are schools that grade a little differently. All of these schools are schools that grade a little differently too. But all of these schools are schools that pretty much grade in the same way. So what we see here is, yes, there are some tough grading schools and there are some easy grading schools, but the vast majority of schools are here. They're not really having any effect on the student's college GPA once we control for their high school, once we control for their other characteristics of them in the high school. So we have a few schools where there is a high school GPA effect, but not very many. We do the same thing at the district level, and this graph looks even more alarming. It looks a little bit like my heart sometimes, but these are districts, or LEAs, and some of the LEAs, and again the zero line here is college districts which have no effect on high school GPA, and you can see that most of the districts are pretty close to zero in terms of the effect they have on on college GPA. Most of them are in this line. There are a few down here and there are a few up here, but most of the districts are within this line, and these choppy lines are the confidence intervals. So these are how sure I am that this is a real effect. And you can see there's a lot of variation in here, but broadly this line is pretty flat, meaning that it's not the district that is giving the student the high school GPA. It's not the school that's giving the student the high school GPA. It's the student who's getting a high school GPA. And there are some colleges, some districts and some schools that give easy GPAs, but not very many. Certainly not enough to explain this effect. So we think high school GPA is a real thing that is very valuable for assigning students to developmental education and assigning them to college level classes. And we also think that there are quite a few errors on both sides of the overplacement and underplacement. So what should we do about this? Well, the first step would perhaps be to worry about the stakes of the placement test. If the placement test has to be a little imperfect, then we should really make sure that it's not condemning students to developmental education from which they'll never get out, or it's not propelling students into college level classes that they're woefully underprepared for. So one approach which a lot of systems are doing is essentially to not make this such a high stakes test. The second is to think, well, there are a lot of students who fail the placement test who probably could have done okay in the college level class. So there are more students who are underplaced than overplaced. And that suggests to us that the balancing is not quite right, and that we should maybe worry more about those who fail the placement test than we currently are. So it seems like some of the students who go into developmental education would have managed to make it through college level class, and that if the weighting of the errors if the balance of the errors is not correct, it's not correct because too many students are going into developmental education. And then the third step, which is what we hope to be able to help with, was to use better information from elsewhere. So that would be basically building a model that predicts how well students would do, that is more accurate than we currently have. Now, in order to try to move forward with that third part of the model, with that third question, we thought, well, what is high school GPA, and what is it picking up, and whatever else it isn't picking up, let's see if we can measure that, and then we'll use that measure and help put students in developmental education or college level classes. So in other words, we need to understand what high school GPA is, and then we need to find out, and then when we know what it is, we'll know what it isn't, and then we'll have to find some measures to explain the things that high school GPA doesn't explain. So we think that high school GPA is a measure of effort and a measure of cognitive skills, but we need some other measures that capture other attributes that students need for college. So whatever those attributes are, diligence, conscientiousness, any other attributes, financial circumstances, personal family circumstances, anything, they need to be things that are not about effort, and they're not about cognition, because we already have high school GPA for that. So that's why we say other attributes. We need things that'll just pick up that'll pick up things other than effort and cognition. And the reason we say that is because the high school GPA appears to be much better than the placement test, but then when you put the two together, you don't seem to do much better in predicting student performance. And why don't you do much better? Because both of the tests are picking up the same thing. They're both picking up effort and cognitive skills. It's just one of them is much better at picking it up than the other. But we recognize that students have a lot of other skills, and so we need measures that can pick up those other skills. So we won't improve placement accuracy if we just test for the same thing that high school GPA tests. So we have three options. The options are the placement test and the ACT, more high school transcript information, or non-cognitive tests. So those are kind of our other options to add into the mix of how to assign students. I think I've already mentioned that we don't feel that adding in high school transcript information is very helpful, because high school transcript information doesn't add anything beyond high school GPA. And even when it does add something, it's not obvious how we're going to pick those items out of a transcript. So the courses taken, math courses taken, honors courses, F grades, which one of those things are we going to pick out and say that is going to tell us how to assign a student? So there's no obvious way, and so that means we can't easily write a formula to explain how to assign students. And one of the virtues of a placement test is it's a very straightforward formula. You're either above or below this cutoff. And if we start introducing items from the transcript, then it starts to become very complicated, and the formula has to get very complicated, and so we don't have a way to easily combine items into a single model, and if a student has something missing, we don't know exactly what to do with that. So high school transcript is not a very promising piece of information that we think is going to help in assigning students to developmental education or not. There are a lot of non-cognitive tests that we could use. There are student learning strategy tests, critical thinking tests. there are tests that assess learning approaches and preferences. There are tests that identify readiness for and tests on high-risk students. There are tests on adult learners. And these tests are promising because they seem to capture things other than what the high school GPA captures, but they need to add a lot of power to our tests. They need to be very explanatory beyond high school GPA. So we don't want to be giving a test and it just helping us place better a couple of students out of every 1,000 students that we give the test to. It needs to be a pretty powerful non-cognitive test. So, in that respect, we default to high school GPA, and statistically we could use multiple measures, and we could calculate probabilities, and more information is always better. Multiple measures are always better than single information, but of course you're working in a system where you have to administer the test. That takes time. If the student doesn't have information, you have to make some assumptions about what the missing information means. It makes the rules very complicated, and in some cases might reduce the legitimacy of the rule. So I do a lot of advising of students myself, and if they don't understand the rules, they tend to reject the rules. And if I can explain the rules, then even if the rule goes against them, then it's a much smoother path to assigning them to the appropriate courses. And the more tests you have, the more complicated it gets, and the harder it is to explain the test. So each additional test better be a good test, and each test better explain quite a bit more to justify its use. And so that's because these tests are expensive and time-consuming, that suggests to us that the multiple information comes in the form of using a single measure and then giving students exemptions or waivers. And those would be embodied in a high school GPA rule, which might involve something like remediating anyone into English and math whose high school GPA falls below a certain number. And I don't want to say what that number is, but it's just an example of a rule. And so the general logic is your high school GPA is a little bit lower than your college GPA. So if you think about what college GPA you want to get, the high school GPA has got to be correspondingly adjusted. So, and then you might use a rule that says if the high school GPA is below a certain number, then you can use a placement test to assign students to that rule. Now, I think I'm a little bit behind, so I'm going to skip ahead. But we simulate in our model what would happen if we remediated anybody below a certain cutoff, and it would reduce remediation, and it would reduce the severe error rate by a little bit, just plausibly from the results that we presented before. Now, so I've skipped a little bit ahead because I want to have time for questions. These webinars are interesting, but I don't get any feedback until I've finished, which is a little challenging. There are a couple of issues with using high school GPA. The first is older students. If they don't have a high school GPA, what are you going to do? The second is that if you didn't do well in high school, then we're somewhat perpetuating that high school performance. There are some issues of, well, why was it used if it wasn't designed for placement? If you change the rule, then you're going to change the students who are in the system, and college instructors will have to change how they teach the students. And then there are some imprecisions, some ways in which the high school GPA might suddenly gravitate, everybody's high school GPA might suddenly gravitate towards the cutoff in the school system. We don't think those are incredibly problematic, but there are some issues with the rule. There are some questions with using a high school GPA rule as well. The first is it durable? How long is your high school GPA valid for? And we think it's valid for a reasonable amount of time, but in our data we don't have students who graduated a long time before. So we don't know how long your what the expiration date on your high school GPA. We don't know how long that is, but we suspect that it doesn't expire very rapidly. We know that it doesn't expire in terms of its effect on your income, and we also know that that these things tend to be reinforcing. So if you have a high school GPA, you might get assigned to tasks that are more challenging, and that'll sort of reinforce your high school GPA. Another question is, will high school GPA impact some students more than other students? So will the college composition, either by ethnicity, race, or gender, will that be different with a high school GPA? There are issues about why it wasn't used initially. Why did we get rid of high school GPA? And if we use high school GPA, will this affect college finances for colleges if developmental education is cheaper than college courses? So once you start changing the composition of the college, then you start changing the college's finances. So those are some questions with the high school GPA rule. And then there are some problems with the high school GPA rule. The first one, obviously, is what if the student doesn't have high school GPA? Well, those students will still need a test. How can high school GPA explain performance in math and in English? In other words, high school GPA is essentially either assigning you to a lot of developmental education, or it's assigning you to none, whereas the placement tests were subject-specific, and they were assigning you to either math or English or both. And so that's going to perhaps lead to some sort of clumping of students who are in developmental education for everything and students who are not in developmental education for anything. And so those are some issues. Now the missings, obviously, we can't do anything about. And then so these two other issues are essentially the high school GPA is not really a subject-specific test, and so it's going to cluster students. So we recognize that high school GPA is not a panacea, it's not a global solution to any assignment policy. Now, as it turns out, colleges could do a better job of collecting high school GPA. So high school GPAs may be missing, but when we looked at it, we found that a lot of the reason high school GPAs are missing is because colleges vary in collection rates. Some colleges have over 90% of students who have high school GPAs, and some colleges have less than 40%. So we think if high school GPA was collected and known to be used, then the number of missings would drop significantly. The other problem is a more important problem, which is that the high school GPA is not a subject-specific test. And so the question that is put to us is how can this be? How can high school GPA explain math readiness and reading readiness? And our answer seems to be, it seems to do okay on both tests. And we can see a little bit of this in some of the correlations we have. These are correlations between your high school GPA and your performance in selected developmental education classes in the North Carolina Community College system. So this is the correlation between your high school grade and, in the one case, your math scores, and these ones, and then in the other case, your English scores. And you can see that your high school GPA is correlated almost identically with your math grades and your English grades. So this number is the same, 35, 34, 36% correlation for the math courses and the English courses. So it really doesn't seem to be the case that high school GPA explains your English score but not your math score. If it explains either, it explains them at the same rate. That's also true when we look at the correlation between your high school GPA and your performance in the gatekeeper college level class. So these are the English classes, and this is the math class, and you can see these correlations are pretty much the same, 0.9 to 1.4, 0.7 to 1.17. It's pretty much the same correlation whether it's English or math. And in fact, if we look at some other data from another data set, a national data set, we can see that as your high school GPA goes up, your probability of taking developmental education goes down faster for math than it does for writing and English. So the high school GPA is actually a better model for predicting math than it is for predicting English scores. So the worry that math faculty might have that high school GPA is not telling you whether a student can do the math may even be the other way around. The worry should be that the English faculty are saying high school GPA isn't going to tell me that the student can read and write to a college level. So that gives us some confidence in high school GPA. And I've been speaking for, I guess, 50 minutes, Cynthia. That seems like a long time. And so I'll just wrap up with some conclusions. Tests are not independent things. You have to put a test in its context of how it is used. And so it's not really a test's fault in any sense. It's how we use the tests. Now, obviously, if we use the tests and the results always come out badly, then the test, no matter how we use it, is not very successful. But there may be scenarios in which the test is used in better ways than in other ways. But even if that's the case, the high school GPA seems to have very predictive power across all sorts of college performance metrics, and that if we wanted to add in other multiple measures, then we need information on other things that affect student performance. And for ours at least, which we would welcome any input on, we don't know exactly how to capture those other dimensions. We recognize that high school GPA can't solve all of the assignment challenges, but it does have some problems, but it seems like it has many more advantages than it has problems for improving access to college-level courses, which I think is what we would hope an assignment rule would do. An assignment rule would help students access the college courses as soon as they're ready to do so, and not put them in developmental education when they really don't need to be there. So I think that's the end of the webinar. There's a lot more information on the CCRC website, and I think they're also on Facebook too.
We have quite a few questions, Dr. Belfield. If you'd like to read the question and then answer it, I believe we have somewhere around 17, 18 questions.
Great. Okay, well, we might as well just go through them. So I don't understand how you determine whether a student would have made a B or higher for the severe error rate. On what is this metric based? Well, we have a lot of information about the student, and we know for students who take the course, we know whether they got a B or not. So for students who don't take the course, we put in the information of that student, and we essentially predict their grade. So we don't have the actual grade for the student, but we have a predictive model that gives us an estimate of how likely it is that they would have gotten a B or not. And then we can use a cutoff. Some people use a cutoff of 50% to say, oh, well, you would have gotten a B if your probability of getting a B was above 50%. So it is a little complicated, and I didn't have time to go into details of it in the presentation, but it's just a predictive model. How well does the placement assessment predict success in the course that the student was placed? as opposed to college GPA, because the purpose of the placement assessment is not to predict college success, but to accurately evaluate content ability and therefore a correct course placement. Well, the placement does not do a great job in predicting success in the course that the student was placed in. So we looked at their gatekeeper scores in gatekeeper math with the math test, the placement math test, and gatekeeper English with the placement English test, and those correlations are pretty weak. They're not strong correlations at all, so purely in terms of the actual course that the student is supposed to be in, then the placement tests are not doing a great job there either. So I appreciate that you really want to narrow this down to the subject-specific details, but even when you do that, you find that the placement test is not a great predictor of the actual gatekeeper course grade. So a student who gets a 75 is not going to, that's not going to help you predict their 75 in the AccuPlacer math. That's not going to help you predict their grade in math 110, for example, very easily.
Dr. Belfield, questions
Yes.
3 and 6 are duplications, basically, so you can answer that.
Okay. We use an, I think we use an unweighted GPA, and I'm pretty sure it doesn't make a lot of difference for the GPA analysis. We have the weighted and the unweighted, but they're not that different really when you're looking across thousands of students. And that is to say, the variation in them is not that different. So everybody might be a little bit higher with one GPA than another, but that doesn't really matter for us. What would matter is if some students were had a high weighted average but a low unweighted average. That would be a problem for us, and we don't see a lot of that in the data. The GPA is 11th and 12th grade. The high school GPA is your 11th and 12th grade high school GPA. So question 4, based on the completion rates of students who are placed into developmental ed, it's safe to say that placement scores are predictive of completion. However, placement scores are not predictive of college GPA. But might student ability be a confounding variable? In other words, students who are not academically prepared would get a low GPA, but they don't persist. That could decouple placement tests from college GPA because the low end of the GPA range is removed. That's a good point. There is a lot of censoring of people, people who drop out because they don't get the placement test score they need, or some other censoring. They don't do as well in their other courses. We prefer to choose GPA, general GPA, because we wanted to see how the students take a lot of different courses, and we wanted to see generally how well they would do. In other words, it's true that we want to put them in the right college level gatekeeper math or gatekeeper English, but we also want them to get further ahead too. We don't just want them to take gatekeeper math and gatekeeper English. We do look at those grades, but we did want to look more generally as well at how well they progress. Not least because one of the problems with developmental education courses is that once you get into them, it slows you down. So you can't accumulate as many college credits. And that was something that we wanted to look at. We wanted to look at college credits and as well as college GPA. But that's a good point. There is quite a bit of selection and people moving around when they don't when the results aren't the best for them. How long was a student who had been out of high school before taking courses at an NCCCS school taken into consideration. We looked at this. This was a good question. Somebody else asked us this question, and we looked at this, and we don't have many years. So we have, this is data from the late 2000s, so 2006, 7, 8, and we have high school students who have been out since about 2004, 5, 6, 7. So they haven't been out very long. So we can only look a few years. Does it matter if you go straight to college, or does it matter if you take a few years out of high school and then go to college? We don't have a huge sample for that, but it wasn't obvious. There was no obvious result that said, oh, you really should use the high school GPA straight after, only for students who come straight in. It didn't really seem like that. It seemed like this high school GPA could be useful for quite a few years. No, we did not. Sorry. Did this research include private high school and home schools, or just public schools? It's only North Carolina public school students. Good question. How many students were in the ACT and the SAT matched data sets? Not very many, a few hundred. Not many students take the SAT and the ACT and then go into the North Carolina Community College system, and some of them are exempt if they get a high SAT or ACT score. So we have only a few hundred students in those SAT and ACT samples. One of the interesting things is going to be in North Carolina when the ACT is taken more generally. What is the ACT? How is that going to be factored into decisions? And that's an important question, and I don't like to make predictions because I would go broke if I had to make predictions. But I'll make a prediction that the high school GPA is still going to be very useful even when we have all this information about the ACT. For the graph that compared severe error rates for high school GPA and Compass Accuplacer, why is the error rate for the high school GPA different for the two comparisons? Good question. It's different because the numbers of students who are put into developmental education is different in the two systems, and the information that we have is a little different across the two systems. So it's a good question because you would think those two numbers would be the same, but the two tests give different rates of developmental education, and they're also used on different types of students. So that's why those numbers are a little different. So that was the data from public high schools alone, or private and homeschool GPAs factored into. It's just the public schools, public high schools. Was the student only for students who graduated high school, or did it include the high school GPA of students who didn't graduate but later completed a GED? Good question. We don't ask them whether they graduate from high school. We just ask for their high school GPA. If they access the community college system with a GED and they have a high school GPA, then we include them in our sample. It's not just high school graduates. There's no restriction on whether you're a high school graduate or not. How can colleges reduce the stakes of placement tests? That's a great question. It's also a really big question. I guess there are many different ways. They can change the levels. They can make it so the students who fail the placement test maybe get another chance to take another test, or the developmental education can be modularized. There are many, many reforms which might be used. Unfortunately, that's not really a field I've done any work in. It's more just an implication of, if you have a test that's not very accurate, then don't make it very important. Dr. Belfield's research said looking at individual courses on high school transcripts is not as predictive as the GPA as a whole, but would it not be just as important to know if a student has a background in algebra in addition to his or her high school GPA test scores. Well, we thought that too. We thought that the math stuff would be very predictive. And it's true that the number of math courses you have is a good explanation of the how well you'll do in the North Carolina Community College system. But so is the number of English courses. We did look at different math courses too, algebra and trigonometry and the other high school math courses, but they really didn't move the needle as much as high school GPA. So it's possible that you could get a better model if you really drilled down and found really specific courses, and you could name those courses and you could trace them through. It's true, you could do a little better than we have done, but the problem that we face is that these are tests that have to be administered quickly and they have to be administered comprehensively, and so there's a trade-off there between incredibly detailed information and applicability across all students. Question 13. Would there be any validity with this study for CCP students who do not meet the testing minimums and do not have a full year transcript with final GPA?
Clive, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Hey, that's Career and College Promise, I believe, which is our dual enrollment framework. So that question may be, basically that's the determination. I think they're asking whether these scores or this has implications for students in high school who are assessed and determined whether or not to be eligible to enroll in college courses while still in high school.
Right. Thank you, Cynthia. I'm not sure how valid it would be. Our high school GPA is an 11th and 12th grade high school GPA, so we don't know exactly how much of a high school GPA you need to predict through this model, but I suspect that the model would work okay with just an 11th grade GPA. It might even work better, but we do use 2 years of high school GPA, so in that sense, if you only have 1 year, then that 1 year might still be useful. How does this correlate to approximate course placement, the correlation of high school GPA to course placement? Well, that's a good question. The reason why I didn't go too far into this is it depends what rule you apply for high school GPA. You kind of have to apply a cutoff rule, and I don't want to second guess what the best cutoff rule would be. My rough rule of thumb is that if you're a B+ student in high school, you'll be a B- student in college. So and one of the things about these types of placement tests is that researchers come and are asked, well, how accurate is the placement test? And then we find ourselves saying, well, what do you want it to be accurate of? And what is a good outcome for you? So a college might say, well, if 20% of the class fails Gatekeeper English, that's not a bad thing for us. Another college might say, well, no, really that means that we've put a lot of students in the wrong boxes. And then another college might say, well, as long as they get a D, that's fine. Another college might say, no, if they get a D, they're just going to fail the next course along the line. So we need them to get a C in Gatekeeper English or Gatekeeper Math. So it's a good question because it kind of throws us back to what exactly do we want a student to have gotten out of Gatekeeper Math. How well do they have to do in these early courses for us to be satisfied that we've put them on the right path? I mean, maybe if the college completion rate is low, then maybe we're not putting enough people in developmental education, because once they get out of it, they're not completing anyway. So to answer the question, it depends on how high a GPA rule you set. but it's sort of a bigger question because the rule you set is going to depend on how well you think students should do in these gatekeeper courses. Can we have clarification on how this model may affect the DE numbers? Yes, I'm sorry, I skipped over that a little bit because we were running out of time. But if you use a high school, and the PowerPoints, there is an example where if you use a high school GPA that is a 2.5, then you're going to get, sorry, let me start again. If you use a high school GPA where everybody is in college ready who gets a high school GPA of above a 3, then the college ready group would be about 40% and the developmental education group would be about 60%. So, I mean, I've told this long story of high school GPA and placement tests, but in actual fact, the high school GPA would be more predictive, but it's not a huge change. It sounds like a huge change, but in terms of actual numbers of people, it's not a huge change. So, and to clarify, will depend on the high school rule you use, but there is a slide 25, that gives us sort of an idea of this, and this is not a rule that would dramatically change the numbers of students in developmental education and college ready. It's not a rule where we're saying, oh, developmental education is being cut and college ready is expanding dramatically. There would be some shifting, but not enormous shifting.
With that being said, Dr. Belfield, if you could answer question number 19, which is not on the page yet, but that is, are you willing to share your slides so people can see them again and actually print them off? And I will tell the audience that this presentation has been recorded, so the slide presentation as well as your narrative and these questions will also be available, typically within 24 hours. But if somebody were to contact you, would you be willing to share your slides?
I would be willing. I didn't know you were recording me, but
yes, our webinar is recorded and it is archived for people to view later as well.
Well, there you go. It's already out. Once it goes on the internet, I can't do anything.
Right. It's at successnc.org for anyone who's interested.
Yeah, it's a good question because obviously, we're not really giving a rule. We're just giving a sort of a way to interpret, a way to apply a rule, a thing to use in your rule. We're not actually giving you a direct rule. But on one of the slides, we do give an example of that. And the bottom line of that slide is, this is just about making changes at the margin. It's not an enormous upheaval of who goes where. Is there a correlation for high school GPA and STEM curriculum math classes? That's similar to the earlier question. As we mentioned, the math courses do pick up some effects, and they are independent of high school GPA, yes. So there is a math effect there, but in terms of making a difference to placement in developmental education, it's not a huge difference. 17, the correlations between high school GPA and grades in gatekeeper courses don't explain much of the variation in grades in these classes. This indicates to me that high school GPA might not have much predictive power when it comes to grades in gatekeeper courses, even if those correlations are statistically significant. Might that be an effect of very large sample sizes rather than a pedagogically meaningful prediction? Well, it's true that those numbers are not incredibly high, 0.7 to 0.17. Those are not incredibly high numbers. But one of the reasons why it's not incredibly high is that the placement test has kind of gotten in the way of this thing. The placement test is the thing that's assigned people, and the placement test is a very fuzzy assigner. And so in those raw correlations, the placement test has kind of interfered with this correlation. I mean, a correlation of 0.15 just for a raw variable is not too bad. we can see that more generally the high school GPA is a better predictor. But yeah, it's not an incredibly strong predictor, but it's not that bad, 15% for just one variable. But it's true, we would like a variable that predicted at a much higher rate. That's a good question. Was the high school track accounted for college prep versus occupational track? Somebody else asked us this before, and so we looked into it, and our samples get a little small, but there doesn't appear to be any obvious way in which the college prep students differ from the occupational track students in terms of the results that we have here. So we tell pretty much the same story for college prep and occupational track.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Belfield, and thank you to our audience for all those wonderful questions. Before we wrap up today, I'd like to remind everyone to check out the website, successnc.org, for our other videos and other webinars that have been archived on that site. And I also want to thank our presenter, Dr. Belfield, once again for sharing with us today. You did a wonderful job, and we really appreciate it. This concludes our webinar, and on behalf of the North Carolina Community College System, we thank you for your participation and hope you have a great day. Thank you.